Hello, I'm doing a movie review, and the movie I want to review is the 1955 British science fiction horror film, The Quatermass Experiment, which also goes by the title The Creeping Unknown. Now, for some reason, in Experiment, they dropped the E, I guess to stylize the title, but even though I do like this movie, that was stupid as hell. Now, the Quatermass Experiment was put out by British film studio Hammer, who would later become best known for their gothic horror films like The Curse of Frankenstein and The Horror of Dracula. Now, the Quatermass Experiment was co-written and directed by Val Guest, and the movie is also based on the 1953 BBC miniseries of the same name, which was written by Nigel Kneale. Now, I've only seen the first 2 episodes of the miniseries because, unfortunately, those are the only 2 surviving episodes of the miniseries. The rest of the episodes are now considered to be lost. Now, towards the end of this review, I'll talk a little bit more about the original miniseries and how much the original miniseries influenced and why those episodes are now lost. Now, the plot of the Quatermass Experiment is, in the movie you find out that the British rocket group, headed by a professor named Bernard Quatermass, sent the first manned mission into space. Now, keep in mind, this movie came out before mankind actually did go into space, so in this movie's universe, this is the first time that people have ever been into space. But shortly after being launched into space, this rocket ship ends up crash landing at this farm, and they open it up, and this was a 3-manned mission into space, but when they open up the rocket ship, they find that 2 of the astronauts have mysteriously vanished, and only one of them is still left. And this surviving astronaut, whose name is Victor Carew, appears to be in sort of a state of shock, like, he's barely speaking, and he almost appears to be in sort of a catatonic state, and you eventually find out that there's this weird fungus growing on his arm. And he's taken to the hospital, but later on, Carew's wife, who blames Quatermass for her husband's predicament, ends up getting him out of the hospital, and it turns out that this fungus that is growing on his arm is spreading, and it's slowly turning him into a giant monster. So in the movie, Carew, being possessed by this alien fungus, goes on a rampage throughout London, and Quatermass and a few of the other characters now have to stop him, and that's the basic plot line of the Quatermass Experiment. Now, the Quatermass Experiment is a fantastic sci-fi horror film, and if you're a fan of horror science fiction films from the 1950s, then I would definitely recommend this. And the film is surprisingly graphic for its time. Like, it's a little tame by today's standards, but in the film you see some of Carew's victims, and, like, their faces are melted off, and once again, it's a little tame by today's standards, but for its time, 1955, I could see that actually being pretty shocking, actually. Now, in the movie, Carew is played by Richard Wordsworth, who, in my opinion, steals this film from the rest of the cast. Like, he gives such a heartbreaking performance in this film as this character, as this man who is slowly turning into a monster, and you realize he did not ask for this, and despite the fact that he has literally only 1 line of dialogue in the entire film, he, in my opinion, gives the best performance in the whole damn film, and you feel so bad for him. Like, there's this really heartbreaking scene in the movie where he's hiding out at these boats, and all of a sudden he runs into this little girl, and the little girl wants to play with him, and you could just see it in his face, like he's trying to keep away from this girl because he knows his alien half is taken over, and he knows his alien half will do something horrible to this little girl, so you could just see him fighting his other half. And Wordsworth, he conveys all this emotion with literally no dialogue. And even though I've only seen the first 2 episodes of the original serial, truth be told, I actually liked Richard Wordsworth better as this character than the actor they got to play Carew in the original miniseries. Now, in the movie, the character of Quatermass is played by Brian Donlevy, I think I'm saying his last name right, and Nigel Kneale was actually very unhappy with his casting as this character, and truth be told, I actually don't blame him, because Brian Donlevy is probably my least favorite part of this entire movie. To me, he plays the character of Quatermass as kind of a dick, honestly, and I'm not sure if I should really blame the actor. I more so blame the way the character of Quatermass was written in this film, because in the movie, Quatermass comes off as being kind of a jackass, whereas in the original miniseries, he was a much more compassionate man, and he showed a lot more sympathy towards Carew and Carew's wife in the original miniseries. In this, Quatermass comes off as, once again, really more of a dick in my opinion. But I really don't blame the actor, because Brian Donlevy actually does do a good job in this movie. I more so blame the way the character was written in this movie. Now, Quatermass was originally played by Reginald Tate in the original miniseries, and once again, I think Reginald Tate played the character so much better. I also don't particularly like what this movie did with the character of Judith Carew, because even though I've only seen the first 2 episodes of the original miniseries, in the original miniseries, the character of Judith Carew came off as a much more sympathetic character, whereas in this movie, and once again, I don't blame the actress, I more so blame the way the character was written, but in this movie, the character comes off as being kind of a stupid bitch, honestly, whereas in the original miniseries, she was a much more sympathetic character. Now, as I mentioned before, the first 2 episodes of the BBC serial that this movie is based on are the only 2 surviving episodes. Now, the reason for that is because at the time, this was 1953, television was such a new format that I really think nobody really knew what the hell they were doing at the beginning, and the BBC never saved any of their stuff. Like, they would always reuse the same tapes and just record over what they recorded, so as a result, I'm sure there are a lot of television programs from this time that are now lost forever, and that's essentially what happened with the other 4 episodes of the original miniseries. So now only the first 2 episodes of the original Quatermass Experiment miniseries are available, but fortunately you can watch them on YouTube. Now, the original miniseries that this movie is based on was extremely influential, because at the time science fiction was really considered to be kids stuff, even though if you actually look at science fiction literature, you would realize that there has always been science fiction for adults, but as far as like the mainstream were concerned, science fiction was just kids stuff, and this was considered to be one of the first adult pieces of science fiction. And the original miniseries really did pave the way for stuff like Doctor Who, and you could even make the argument that Hollywood science fiction films that would come out later on, like 2001: A Space Odyssey and even Alien, owe a little something to the original Quatermass Experiment miniseries. The miniseries also had a huge influence on people like Stephen King and John Carpenter, and the miniseries really would set the template for the rest of Nigel Kneale's career. Shortly after writing the teleplay for the Quatermass Experiment, he also wrote the teleplay for the 1954 made-for-TV adaptation of George Orwell's 1984, which was actually extremely controversial when it came out. Nigel Kneale would also go on to write other well-known made-for-TV movies like The Year of the Sex Olympics and The Stone Tape. Nigel Kneale also wrote the original screenplay for Halloween 3, but then asked to have his name taken off of it because he didn't like what John John Carpenter and Tommy Lee Wallace did to his original script, which is a shame because Halloween 3 is awesome. In 1955, Nigel Kneale wrote a sequel to the Quatermass Experiment titled Quatermass 2. Hammer would eventually do a film based on Quatermass 2 of the same name in 1957, which was once again directed by Val Guest. Now, the 1957 movie version of Quatermass 2 was released in America under the title Enemy from Space. Nigel Kneale would eventually write a third Quatermass serial titled Quatermass and the Pit, which was released in 6 parts on the BBC between the years 1958 and 1959. And Quatermass and the Pit is arguably the most famous of all the Quatermass serials. Hammer would go on to do a film adaptation of Quatermass and the Pit in 1967, however the movie version of Quatermass and the Pit was released in America under the title 5 Million Years to Earth. Nigel Kneale would go on to write a 4th Quatermass serial titled The Quatermass Conclusion, which came out in 1979, and this serial does have a movie version of it, however the movie version of the Quatermass Conclusion is actually just all the episodes of the serial just edited down and condensed to a 100-minute long movie. Now, there was also a made-for-TV remake of the Quatermass Experiment in 2005, and the character of Bernard Quatermass really has gone on to become a pretty iconic character. But yeah, that was my review on the Quatermass Experiment, and my next movie review will be on Hammer's adaptation of Quatermass 2.